Well, hello. Good morning for some of you, good evening for some of you, and welcome to today's dialogue. It's EcoCiv Dialogues on Global Systems Change. So my name is Andrew Schwartz. I'm co-founder and vice president for the Institute for Ecological Civilization, as well as executive director of the Center for Process Studies. I have the privilege of moderating today's dialogue, which is on the topic of conservation economies, reframing the conversation. What exactly is a conservation economy? That's something we're going to explore, as well as this community-based approach. It's going to be fun. Some framing thoughts to get us started before we introduce our panelists and dive right in. So in Western environmentalism, and we're talking contemporary throughout the 21st century, rural and indigenous communities have often been excluded from conversation around conservation. And that's basically because the prevailing conservation model, which is called a fortress conservation, is rooted in the belief that the best way to protect biodiversity, which is a great goal, is to create areas where ecosystems can function freely without human disturbance, right? We're the problem, get humans out of the way, let's protect, creating a fortress, right, around pockets of nature that will help keep out our harmful influences of humanity. But then what happens to all the people that live in these places, right? The people, these places that we seek to conserve. Can humans live in harmony as part of the natural ecosystem without creating fences and establishing fines to ensure compliance? So in the midst of these sorts of questions, a relatively new but also fast-growing movement is exploring alternatives to fortress conservation, and it's questioning the core premise of this prevailing model, questioning, is the best way to protect biodiversity really to exclude humans, to exclude local and indigenous people? So today's dialogue on conservation economies, on community-based conservation, is going to explore why the fortress conservation model that dominates dialogue around conservation today doesn't actually work as well as we hoped, and why community-based conservation models are critical in a fight to protect biodiversity. So actually, EcoCiv is launching a new program on conservation economies. We're hoping to draw on experts like those from today's esteemed panel, and that those experts will help inform where our work goes as a connecting organization so that we can be most impactful. So I'm actually really excited then, a little selfishly, to see where the conversation on conservation takes us today, because it's going to have direct impact on shaping my organization's programs. We do have a fantastic group of panelists joining us today, and they're going to share their insights, their expertise on this paradigm shift in conservation methodologies and practices for the long-term well-being of people and the planet, our common goal. So my colleague Megan Anderson is actually going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll get the conversation underway. Megan.
Thank you, Andrew, and once again, thank you, wonderful panelists, for joining us for this conversation today. So our first panelist is Lisa Ferguson. She is the Sustainable Livelihoods Advisor with the Nature Conservancy's Conservation in partnership with Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities team. She works globally with field staff and partners to identify and overcome common sustainable livelihoods challenges and create resources to help cultivate Indigenous and local leadership of sustainable economic systems. Lisa has an MBA with a finance concentration from the University of Iowa, ranked by the Financial Times as the top finance MBA in the world. Her prior areas of focus have included impact investment, investment management, and business strategy, and she is currently based in Colorado. James Arnot is the project director at CWC Africa Projects and founder of Arnot Consulting. He was born in 1968 in, I'm gonna mess up the name of reading this, Pietermaritzburg, KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. James, you can correct my pronunciation of that afterwards. He attended Michael House in the Midlands and matriculated in 1968. He subsequently studied a BCom degree at Pietermaritzburg's and graduated in 1989, majoring in business information systems, business administration, and purchasing management. James' original career revolved around corporate strategic brand marketing in the FMCG field, and he made the move into his own business in 2003 and has since worked in hospitality, residential, commercial, and industrial sectors with some great companies on various projects and developments in the past 20 years. And then we have Sahara Zede, or Sarah for short, is co-executive director of Progress. She co-founded Progress to protect Sulawesi threatened and overlooked wildlife through community and science-based approaches. She spent her childhood close to the forest of Lahore Lindu National Park in central Sulawesi. Her love for nature finally brought her to study biology at the University of Indonesia. Afterwards, she worked in a grassroots organization before pursuing her master's degree in wildlife ecology and conservation at the University of Florida with a USAID CIFOR fellowship. After graduating, she joined the WCS Indonesia as a conservation science specialist, while also being the president of Tambora Muda, a national lover network for Indonesian young conservationists. Sarah recently won the Louis F. Bacardi Advances in Tropical Conservation Award in 2020 and was listed as one of the Indonesian Woman Earth Guardians in the Tempo magazine. And finally, Jessie Green is the Strategic Projects Development Coordinator at the Institute for Ecological Civilization. Her goal is to help build local and global communities that find strength in cooperation, reciprocity, and mutuality with each other and the environment. Jessie's interdisciplinary background includes expertise in Indigenous land rights, community-based conservation, agroecology, climate resiliency, well-being economies, and responsible tourism. She earned her bachelor's degrees in environment and development, international development, and social entrepreneurship from McGill University. Thank you everyone once again for joining.
Wow, I'm a little intimidated by the quality of our panelists here, but I'm thankful that such an esteemed group is willing to share their expertise. So let's just do it. Let's dive in. I've got a question I want to get us started with to sort of frame everything, and it's not directed at any particular person, so feel free to jump in if you got an idea on this. But I was thinking about community-based economy or conservation and this fortress conservation model. And it occurred to me that in environmental circles, conservation is just generally thought to be a good thing. We want to conserve nature because we depend on nature. It's just a good thing to try to do. And as I was thinking about it, I realized not all models of conservation are created equal. So to get us started, can we just discuss the so-called elephant in the room? In the fortress model of conservation, it would be the elephant in a fence, I guess. It really is the question of what is fortress conservation, and what are some of the ways that this sort of dominant paradigm is actually undermining the fundamental goals of conservation, which is the preservation of biodiversity. Does anybody want to tackle that for us? Get us started? And you put it another way, why community-based conservation? Why do we need that? Is it a solution or an alternative that's trying to fix something that's broken? What's the problem that conservation economies are the solution for? Yeah, I see.
I'm happy to start.
I don't know if we want to yeah, Jessie, please do.
So fortress conservation is centered around the idea that creating protected areas as enclosed ecosystems. And this is problematic because the natural world does not follow the arbitrary boundaries that we create for it. So it's ecologically just an unsound method of conservation. From a social justice perspective, fortress conservation has deep roots in, as you mentioned, a European environmental philosophy centered around the separation of humans from nature. And during colonialism, that logic was used to forcibly remove indigenous peoples from their ancestral homelands all over the world. And land rights abuses under this logic continue to this day. So fortress conservation is not just ecologically unsound, but also socially unjust. And that's why we need to seek alternatives.
Interesting. It's almost like fortress conservation is colonial conservation, is what I was hearing. So we need a post-colonial conservation. So what would that look like? And I see you nodding, James. Do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think, Andrew, bear in mind that the nomenclature that is used around the world varies substantially between the speakers and all those who are listening. But yep, the essence of it all is about engaging with the communities that inhabit the landscapes that we want to conserve. And as you say, the fortress nomenclature, I think, is very powerful, and it's manifested through large proclaimed reserves. I'm talking in an African context and probably globally. But there's this enormous, generally rural population that surround these reserves that are generally very impoverished and do not buy into conservation because it doesn't have any commercial, and I use that swear word, commercial value to them. Because, as I say, you mentioned, Jesse, the colonial model, which is true. Ultimately the colonialists came to Africa and decided to have recreational parks, and there was a good heart to it, to some of it. But in effect, the new thinking, and perhaps a silver lining that COVID's brought to us all, is that the hospitality model of game parks within Africa's landscapes, which generate a certain amount of revenue that goes back to the government through taxes and to a very minor extent to the local communities around those parks, has to change. And hence, our model as CWC Africa Projects, which as you note, I've got a commercial, corporate and property development background, is to go into those landscapes and be tangible, be real with development plans, land use plans that are conservation based, and wait for it, commercially and sustainably utilize the natural resources that those landscapes have in place already for the benefit of those communities. And that requires a huge amount of complexity to be worked through. So this conversation is very top level, but believe you me, it is not easy for those who are listening. But once you've identified the complexity, then the genius is in making it simple. And that's what we're trying to do as an organization.
Very cool. I do hope to tap in a little bit more to your experience there, particularly when it comes to the business background. Sarah, do you want to say something here?
Yeah, I think like in Indonesia context, at least, the fortress conservations kind of started in a way that the prioritizations and how protected areas are given to the authority of certain ministry. So in that way, in the governance level, they feel that they have the authority, the full authority to manage the parks. So during the process, they forgot that the community is actually part of the stakeholders that need to be engaged from the beginning. So I think it's kind of problematic at a system levels, because at the first place, the way we govern the protected area itself in the country, it seems that we give this authority to a certain ministry and they feel that, okay, I have this authority and I'm just gonna manage this. So that is the first problem. But I can see that how the conversations has actually changed and how the community is taken into account into the decision-making process, even though it's not really seen being on par with biodiversity. So it's always be, oh yeah, the elephant first, or like the tiger first, and then what about the community? So it's not really part of the main discussion from the beginning. So, but I'm also into a community-based conservations that is more unique, and I'm very keen to learn from Lisa and also James, because our approach is just to instill the appreciations toward the intrinsic nature, the intrinsic value of nature. So the economic motive or the economic part of it are actually not my organization priority. So it's kind of how our community-based conservations has been work for the past few years. It's kind of new.
Yeah, before we move on, because I want to get Lisa in on this, could you say a little bit about your community-based and science-based approaches to wildlife conservation, and what that looks like in the Indonesian context, and how you think this model benefits, it overcomes some of the shortcomings, right, of this fortress model.
Right. Yeah, I think I totally agree in a way that protected area itself and a system need to be modified to involve and empower community to be the main stakeholders also. But I think that community-based conservations are very potentials to protect those biodiversity and those natural resource use that occur outside the protected area that are left from those very scientific prioritizations. And that's what progress my organization came along, that we protect the wildlife working together with the community outside the protected areas, because they don't have any resources at all or any prioritization from the governments or from other things, but the community really need to maintain that natural resources. But in a way, I can tell you more later about our approach, how we go for the intrinsic values instead of the economics. But yeah, that's some things can be discussed more.
Yeah. So already I'm hearing this is a very complicated issue. We're talking about ecosystems. We're talking about community and social systems. We're talking about economic systems. We're talking about value systems. And it's all of these things, right? Sort of political systems and legal systems having implications on all of this. Lisa, not to throw a pile of complexity in your lap, but I think you can handle this for us. In conservation discourse, I come across this term, conservation refugee. And I'm wondering if we can unpack this notion a little bit by discussing how the livelihood of local and indigenous people is often negatively impacted by this fortress conservation model, and how inclusion of local and indigenous people in a community-based conservation economy actually might help.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think community-based conservation is really about centering Indigenous and local leadership of conservation strategies and ensuring that they're, not only stakeholders that are consulted after the fact, but are really, as Shira is saying, brought in from the beginning and really leading on these strategies. And there's decades of evidence that shows that, not only, as Jesse said, this is the right thing to do from a social justice perspective, but it also actually makes conservation more effective. It makes it, more effective in the moment, and it makes it longer lasting and more durable. And when we're talking about engaging, kind of pulling livelihoods into this, what we're looking at is, I think there's a couple different components. Andrew, as you mentioned, not only is the fortress model of conservation actually negatively impacting livelihoods, but really sort of our go-to economic model is negatively impacting community livelihoods as well, because we live in a world where the fastest way to economic progress often happens through degrading the natural resource base. And so what we're looking at when we're looking at conservation and sustainable livelihoods in partnership with Indigenous and local communities is, first of all, acknowledging that anybody whose basic needs are not met cannot be in a position to think beyond their basic needs. So really can't be thinking about how to conserve the natural resource base, how to be involved in conservation strategies. Second, how can we really look at ways that we can, bolster the economic power of communities so that they can have a stronger negotiating position when these outside forces come in and say, we want to cut down the forest, we want to, destroy the coastline, build a tourism resort here, whatever it might be, making sure that communities have the economic power that they're already earning an income, so they're able to better negotiate against those outside forces. And then it's also really about aligning incentives. So how can we make sure that there are opportunities that simultaneously provide income to communities while protecting the natural environment, instead of those things kind of being opposing forces?
That's exactly where I want to go then next. Can we talk a little bit about the how, maybe some examples of what does it look like to both protect or conserve the biodiversity while at the same time protect and conserve the livelihood of local people and their sort of economic and other well-being. Are there models or examples that we can point to concretely that says this is how it could work? That we don't have to have an economic system that's built on destruction, but it can work together in harmony? Anybody, that doesn't have to be Lisa, but you're welcome to jump in.
Sure, yeah, I can give one example that actually we work on in Indonesia, so Shira might have more to add about this, but a lot of times, you know, in forest-based communities, the go-to economic model is to deforest their natural resources. And so TNC and our partners work with communities in Indonesia to really center their leadership authority in creating durable, sustainable forest management plans. And part of those plans are what are the economic activities that the community wants to be involved in that leave the forest standing strong. And so as a result, we've been able to move away from a deforestation model and toward sustainable forest products that really do leave the forest standing strong. So things like sustainable rubber, cacao, spices. And we're seeing communities make really big strides in terms of the income that they're generating, as well as reduced and stable rates of deforestation in the communities that we're working in.
That's helpful. Anybody else have some examples that come to mind as how this might work?
Andrew, maybe I can jump in there. And I'm going to use the commercial argument again, because this is relatively new thinking. That's why we're having this discussion. And the conservation community at large, whoever they are, you know, the big branded organizations or the small person in the streets, has always kind of put their money into preventative mechanisms to conserve landscapes and wildlife, whether it's saving the rhino or whatever, which is all preventative mechanisms. It's almost plugging the dam wall. So if this is a momentum shift, then these type of conversations need to start varying that money, that soft, I call it soft money, it's non-return money, into community engagement. Because what happens in the process is that the initial process is messy. It's, as we spoke about earlier, it's complicated, it's complex. You are dealing with relatively unsophisticated thought patterns and people with great intent, but they need to be workshopped. And as whether it's Indonesia or Africa, the same principle. They need to be educated in terms of making sure the tree remains upright and the commercial value attached to that versus the chopped down tree, the live animal versus the dead animal. And that process is expensive and costly and complex. And at the moment, there's not enough emphasis on community engagement and workshops, because what that does on the landscapes that are needed to be conserved, it paves the way, and I use this term glibly, but it almost ripens the landscape for the next phase, which is the investor phase. And that's where we come in, which is the commercial hardcore facts. And that is, you need organizations and whatever formal guise, trusts, and that's another whole conversation, a trust or an NPO or a PTY limited, which generates revenues for that community out of conservation-based activities on that landscape. But that only happens once there's this massive collaborative engagement with the community, with land mapping, planning, all of those messy things to get to that point. So my encouragement, if we're coming on these type of forums, is, guys, we've got to change the mindset of the big green organizations to invest in the communities. And they will then become the custodians of the animals and the landscapes that we wanted to protect. And I think I'm going to be resonating with the rest of my panelists that's probably the answer. It's all about resources and alignment of those to make sure that the end result is the most effective.
Yeah, it certainly resonates with me. I'll say, I think that there is sort of a core truth that advocates of fortress conservation have picked up on, and perhaps one of the reasons why it's been so popular. And that's that human economies have, as Lisa said, too often been designed around extraction and destruction of nature. In fact, my friend John Cobb, I've heard him say that GDP is essentially a measure of how quickly we can destroy the planet. So that economy and ecology have been at odds is just sort of a huge problem that obviously we need to think differently about both. But I want, James, if you could say a little bit more about business. So we're talking about what it would look like to have an economic system that works both for the preservation of biodiversity and the well-being of people. But what's the role of businesses in a community-based conservation model?
Well, I think the starting point is that those businesses have to have the right heart. And part of me, having worked in large corporates, a lot of them don't have the right heart. And you refer to that in terms of GDP and growth on profit, etc. So the businesses that are set up on these landscapes involving the communities have to have the right approach and attitude and leadership, etc. That's a given. What do they do on those landscapes? I mean, obviously, you know, a lot of these landscapes are rich in resources and sustainable, renewable resources. So whether it's game farming or high value agriculture or the standard tourism model or low carbon emission production, you know, that kind of development plan, you know, what I would call it in development terms, a master development plan, is what's needed for these landscapes. And then you just got to get going and set these businesses up, you know, and that in itself is complex. But you know, who's going to be the watchdog of whether it's right or wrong business? Because as you say, we always run the fine line between exploitation and sustainable development. But I can assure you that in Africa, when a community gets approached by a mining house versus a conservationist who says, listen, we want you to protect your animals and your landscape, versus the mining house who says, listen, I'm going to give you 1,000 jobs. At the moment, there's a no-brainer for them. Right. So we've got to fight harder for the conservation businesses. That's what I'm saying, and think hard. And they are there. One of our initiatives is a consumer brand called Made Wild, which has as its heart consumer goods that are processed and manufactured on a conservation landscape, which then manifests itself in a branded item on a consumer goods shelf in a Tesco's or a Sainsbury's or wherever it is around the world, where the consumer votes. And then that consumer good, which is now manufactured or sourced on a landscape, becomes a profit center for the community because the consumer's buying it on the shelf. Now, that's the type of thinking that we're trying to promulgate, that these things can be done. They're complex scenarios, but that's just one example of a, let's call it a piece of meat, for want of, there's probably a category, but a consumer category, which somebody's consuming every day of their lives, and suddenly they've got a product that's been consumed, that they know that every cent that's consumed by the product goes back into a conservation landscape. I'm just using examples. As I say, it is a complex scenario, but it can be done, Andrew. And that's why we as CWC Africa projects are very excited. We have an existing project in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, which is a classic case study, which we are working with quite a large organization in the US to roll out exactly what we're talking about.
Very cool.
Can I have questions to James?
Sure.
Yeah, you sent us your presentations, and I'm very curious in a way you approach and start the conversations with the community or the community leaders about developments. How do you build your connections around that? Because for us, we're a very small dot on Earth, and usually from the community perspective that we've worked on, they don't need extra money. So they are fishermen. The way we do it, it's just we just ensure that there's no bombing, and then the bats that we work saving together on the islands, their poops become fertilizer that enrich the oceans nearby, and it makes a lot of fish, and it is good for the fishermen. So from them, the economic perspective is to maintain the services that ensure their current livelihood, so not necessarily to gain a new income source. Yeah, so I'm very curious how do you start the conversations with the community, because for me, even it's a very complicated things, but yeah, how do you do it?
Shara,
Thank you.
in Africa, it's just as complicated, and we engage with an African conservation trust, and they've got a communal planning unit, and that planning unit literally specializes. You know, it's even the language that you engage with the local communities and the tribes in South Africa and KwaZulu-Natal.
Right.
That's a project of ours called Laziba. And that planning unit goes in and engages, and it's workshops, and it's education, and it's building trust. It's getting gatekeepers out of the way. And if you know what a gatekeeper is, it's the guy who wants his pockets filled before anything comes along. So those are the type of engagements that have to be completely resolved before there's any chance of building a conservation economy on that particular landscape. And it's a critical step, and it has to be funded. That's what my initial point was, is that without the big conservation organizations realizing the criticalness of engagement and collaboration with the communities, this whole conservation economy can't move forward. And that's why big business, big nice business, stays away. You know, they stay away from complexity and community development. They'll earn a couple of CSI points, but they won't actively get involved in it because it's complex. So that initial step is absolutely critical, Shara, and it doesn't matter which continent you're talking about, it's exactly the same principle. And we certainly promulgate that. Without that done initially, there's no chance of moving forward. Yeah.
Thanks, James.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Sarah. I mean, what I'm hearing is that there's the sort of traditional way of trying, and I say traditional as in like sort of the modern way of trying to conserve nature. And then there's what you all are actually working on and exploring is a fundamental paradigm shift. The shift from top down to bottom up, a shift from excluding humans to including humans, and particularly local indigenous communities, a shift from an economy that extracts and degrades to an economy that protects and invests in nature. And I think, I mean, it's exciting. I love paradigm shifts. As a philosopher, I'm like, yeah, let's shift those paradigms. But I want to take a minute to have you dream with me. This is, I don't know, we'll see how this goes. I want us to envision our world, let's say 50, even 100 years out into the future. And let's imagine that the whole of humanity has adopted this vision that we're talking about, a community-based model of conservation. What does the world look like? Right? How is society structured? Are there still fences and borders? Are there still cities and urban centers? What does the economy look like? How will future generations relate to the land? And so on and so on. Jesse, I haven't heard from you in a bit, and I'm hoping, what's your dream? Like, what would the world look like if this conservation, this community-based model of conservation sort of took hold in a global way?
I think the piece of it for me that I most want others to take away from it is this learning from Indigenous understandings of nature as deeply interconnected instead of something like separate. So in my ideal world in 50 or 100 years is that everybody kind of understands that. Everybody has taken the time to listen to these Indigenous and local leaders about their understandings and the deep interconnection that we all share. And in that way, you know, all spaces would kind of become conservation economies. The whole planet would just be like one big one, instead of just having these isolated pockets of areas deemed special enough to preserve. You know, we preserve the whole. And in that way, the needs of the people on the planet are balanced, and the goal is no longer exploitation and this kind of infinite growth model.
Interesting. I don't want to detract from the constructive conversation, but you got me thinking in all sorts of ways where I'm like, yeah, even as the whole notion of conserving bioregionally or something, an affront to the interconnection of the entire ecosystem. But we don't have to go down that route. Anybody else want to dream with me? You know, what does the world look like if we are successful in this community-based conservation on a large scale? Lisa?
I'll just add to that. I think, Jesse, I love that description. And Andrew, you're talking about this paradigm shift, and I think that's exactly right. And that's really the way that we talk about our work, is how can we really catalyze this paradigm shift where economies are community-led, are resilient, and are sustainable. And I think that requires a paradigm shift, not only in the way that we think about conservation, but really in the way that many of us just live our lives. I mean, when you think about it, we're all many of us are so disconnected from nature and from the way that products arrive at our doorstep. And so we're not really thinking about, where did our coffee come from? Where did our chocolate come from? Where did our spices come from? Where did this meat come from? And I think that truly, catalyzing an economic paradigm shift is going to be about, centering Indigenous and local people, really changing the way that we think about conservation, but also changing the way that we think about where we put our money and the products that we buy, and shifting toward, making sure that we're purchasing products that are environmentally sustainable, produced by communities. Because one of the big challenges that we see that communities have when they're looking at starting their own sustainable enterprises is around access to markets. And so we really need a shift around that supply and demand of what it means to be in a sustainable economy.
That sounds really important. Can you say more about this access piece? Access to markets.
Yeah, sure. There's actually a lot of different access pieces that we found that are large challenges around sustainable livelihoods. And so we worked with Conservation Strategy Fund on a study of looking at examples of successful community-led sustainable livelihood initiatives around the world, and looking at what are some similar enabling conditions, what are some similar challenges that they're facing, what are the perspectives of investors and other partners in this. And we found that you can really kind of categorize some of the big challenges into four major buckets. One of them, and I think this is a lot of what James was talking about, is really investing in the community, building community capacity, making sure that the community is at the center and has the tools and resources and knowledge and skills that they really need to be leading this work. The other three are really around access. That's access to business assistance, access to markets, and access to financing. You can think about this like very much the same that we might think about starting a business in the United States, or starting a business in Europe, or starting, any sort of business. There's always going to be these challenges around understanding the supply chain, making sure that you have the right value proposition, making sure you have the right level of investment, making sure that you understand your target market and your position to reach that target market. When we're looking at starting conservation businesses, sustainable businesses led by Indigenous peoples and local communities, you take those challenges and you basically just multiply them, 10, 20, 100-fold. And so really we're looking at ways, how can we bring in the right partners to really be able to kind of solve those access challenges and really catalyze conservation economies.
That's huge. And actually, it's exactly where I'm wanting to go next, is to talk more about
Nail on the head.
Next steps. Nail on the head, James. Yeah, exactly.
But Andrew, can I modify your dream a bit?
Oh yeah, please. Make it better.
Yeah, I feel because I've traveled to different parts of Sulawesi in Indonesia, and I've meeting with the community that are so happy. And even though in our standard, that is in our development standard, and then in Indonesia, usually those provinces with a huge amount of forest are correlated with the poverty, they have the lowest GDP level. So I think in our dream, or my dream at least, I want to see that we value not only money. I know that from economic and development perspective, it's the strategic way, of course. It's helped to mainstream biodiversity and conservation issue. And I think it's needed to change our paradigm and our effort. But I also think that it's also important to value other things like happiness, well-being, all those things that's sometimes forgotten from the development perspective, from those people with more privilege, like me in here, more privilege. I wish my friend who's doing the community work with me, be with me and speak on this platform, but I have a privilege to speak English. And I wish the world can speak more languages. So these people have more voice, and voice are power. So those kind of things that, if I may modify a bit your dream, but thank you. And thank you so much for the perspective, Lisa and James. That's very inspiring to me.
I 100% agree with everything you said. Thank you for modifying my dream. I'll throw a little plug in for the EcoCiv Wellbeing Economies California work. Keep up the good work, team. And the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. It's groups of people around the world who are trying to say exactly what you just said so eloquently, is that we have to rethink sort of what the goal is when it comes to economies, beyond just the value of money, beyond just value of growth, but thinking about the sort of holistic perspective of well-being, of happiness. I think the happiness indices are great examples, and Kingdom of Bhutan has done that. More on that some other day, I'm sure. So let's talk about, I think we all want to, I think this common vision is coming together. This is, we've talked about what some of the sort of problems are. We've talked about the solution we'd like to see implemented. Can we talk about how to get there and some of the challenges? So what are the significant obstacles facing sort of the community-based conservation movement? For example, are there legal roadblocks or issues around land ownership? Are there problems with local support and people just being like, I'm not really interested, right? I'd rather get 1,000 jobs than to protect the rhinos. Are there financial limitations? We don't have enough funding and support to do the work or get it off the ground. Are there difficulties overcoming this sort of impulses of consumer-based economies? Are there troubles that are sort of in trying to challenge underlying assumptions about humanity and relationship to conservation? I mean, these are just things I'm wondering about, and I'm sure there are other sort of challenges, but as people, experts who are doing this work, people on the ground, what are the challenges that you see, these obstacles in trying to sort of implement community-based conservation? Anybody?
Yeah, Andrew, I think the answer to every one of those questions is yes, unfortunately. And as James was talking about, this is really complex work. And so one of the things that's been really top of mind for me lately is kind of recognizing that, there's so many of us working on community-based conservation, so many of us working on, some aspect of livelihoods, but there are so many challenges that are in place and so many different things that need to be solved simultaneously to really be able to implement these conservation economies. And I think one of the things that we really need is just more of these organizations, more communities really talking to each other and working together. Because what we have right now is we have everybody's kind of tackling their own little piece of this. So we might be working on the environmental piece, someone else is working on the policy piece, someone else is working on the poverty alleviation piece. But unless we're really, talking to each other and working together and figuring out how can we align our efforts, our strategies, our funding, our community partnerships, I think without that, it's going to be really difficult to tackle all of these challenges at the same time.
Lisa, maybe I can add in there, Andrew. Ultimately, the paradigm shift that you're referring to is significant, and the WWFs of the world and all these fantastic organizations that are doing their bit to save this wonderful planet of ours. If there was a true realignment and understanding of this paradigm shift of engaging with the communities and the people aspect first, which then looks after the conservation aspect, that paradigm shift is massive. And Jesse mentioned it earlier, and it's linked to your big, hairy, audacious dream in 150 years' time. But ultimately, the economy needs to go back into the hands of the people, not these big corporate giants. And then the entire, that's another whole conversation in itself. But the reality is the conservation economy could actually be the global economy in 100 years' time. And that would be my dream. In other words, every single corporate and business decision is made with conservation in mind. And that's what should be the case. So, whilst we're trying to change behavior, and as you say, Jesse, with these landscapes around the proclaimed private protected areas, this should be a global movement. So, I'm obviously passionate about it. That's why I'm here. But I certainly can't do it by myself. Neither can all of you guys. Ultimately, there has to be almost be a movement forward that this conservation economy thinking has to be promulgated and engaged with. And as I say, I think the silver lining of COVID is that the world has woken up to the fact that just a couple of proclaimed areas with saving the whatever at some point is not going to work. It's not going to work anymore. Our landscapes are under severe commercial pressure on population growth, etc. We know, I'm not being the doomsday, but the reality is that this conservation economy thinking is not just an intellectual exercise, it's a critical exercise. Anyhow.
Yeah, I think the challenges will be different at like different levels, because I'm from a very small NGO, so funding is actually a huge problem, because usually the funding for the conservation, they don't want to invest in the people, they want to invest, of course, in the wildlife or in the conservation related works. So that's kind of hard, and usually because we focus on the community-based approach, we need a longer time to build trust and relationship with the community, and grant donors or like potential business partners, they're running out of time and like they want to have a quick result, and that's kind of impossible for us to achieve our expected outcomes. So that's a kind of the challenge. But I think the good thing, even with like COVID pandemics, because we've built trust and relationship with the community, we didn't go there because of the COVID, but they still look after the nature. They still sustainably use and harvest the fish. They still protect the forest and use it just as they need it, not like destroying all the forest while we're gone. So I think that's the building trust is valuable, but sometimes the donor or anyone don't have the belief or trust enough in this approach. So very glad when Jesse and Megan approached me to give a platform to at least showcase that, hey, there's a little bit an alternative that worth the effort. Yeah.
Thank you. Jesse, do you want to jump in on this?
I don't really have much to add. I think that the other panelists covered it quite well. In terms of challenges, my personal area of expertise is land grabbing, and that's got a lot to do with this paradigm shift as well. You know, there's a lot of economic interests in land all over the world, and combating those is partially a policy problem, but also partially a paradigm shift that needs to happen about the way that we use resources and not exploiting them, basically.
Yeah, that ties in perfectly to one of the good questions. We've got a lot of questions coming in from our audience, and one of them has to do with land trusts and whether or not they can play a vital role to encourage conservation. Any thoughts on that? Anybody?
Okay, maybe I should jump in there, Andrew. Hopefully I'm not doing too much talking, but you know, that's part of the complexity, so I don't have the answer. And I've seen situations where trusts work, but they're not a commercially suitable structure. In other words, you can hold the interests of a community within a trust, but then that trust can have equity in a private limited company. So generally it's been used to great extent in the countries that I've worked in as a mechanism to kind of enable the community to have some leadership and say in the process of the conservation economy and whatever economics is happening at that time. But it's not in itself the solution, as I say. Ultimately, if conservation economy business is going to compete at all with mainstream business, and let's talk about those mines for a second, example, then it has to be run like a business. And you've got to have leadership. I think Lisa inferred it earlier. You know, that's why it's complex, and it's already complex to be an entrepreneur and run a business and make profit in this world. Multiply that by 20, and then you've got the complexity that we're dealing with within the rural communities. But it can be done. There are case studies where communities are reaping the benefits from conservation tourism, from sustainable use of resources. There are pockets of examples around Africa there where it has been done. Kenya, Zambia, here in South Africa, but the momentum has to multiply. I mean, these conversations should be being had by, as I say, every single green organization on this planet.
You've mentioned tourism a couple times, and I wonder if we can touch on that a little bit more, because I know from what I've read, some people argue that it's sort of this conservation tourism, ecotourism stuff that's actually part of the problem, because now we've sort of taken away the ability for the local communities to have sustainable livelihoods on their own rights. And now they're dependent on these foreigners coming in to sort of, I don't know, sensationalize their local communities and their environment. But is there a way in which tourism can actually contribute to well-being within a community-based model? I mean, what would that look like? That doesn't have to be to James, just anybody.
Yeah, I think that it's a really interesting question. And I think that when we're thinking about community-led ecotourism, and really with any sustainable livelihoods opportunity, we really need to be thinking through, what are the unintended consequences that can result from this, and what can we do from the get-go to really understand and anticipate and mitigate those unintended consequences. And for tourism, that's around, the carrying capacity of the landscape. It's around, making sure that it really is community-led, that they're not becoming entirely dependent on outside tourism as a source of revenue. I think it's important for livelihoods to be really diversified so that we don't see, if and when tourism collapses, the local economy collapses. There needs to be a diversified source of revenue stream so that they're not just depending on any one source of income. And in terms of ways that I think tourism can be really beneficial, when the study that I mentioned that we did, where we looked at examples of successful sustainable livelihood initiatives, there's a really interesting one out of Peru that was a joint venture between a private company and a local indigenous community. And over the course of 20 years, this private company has been gradually transferring ownership of the company over to the indigenous community. And so that's been a really interesting model where the community is actually, being trained, really building that capacity, building their own resources. And as they have that, additional skills and knowledge, becoming actual owners of the company rather than just beneficiaries.
That's a cool example. Thanks. Gets me excited about what's possible. We've got about 6 minutes left, and I'm trying to think about where to go next. I want to make sure we have a chance to talk about hope. So what we've explored so far has been incredibly complicated. But I also wanted to give an opportunity for you to say, how can people get involved? So I think, I don't know if I can ask both of these at the same time, it might be overwhelming, but question one, take it as you want. People at home are all going to want to know, okay, this is great, I've learned a lot, cool stuff happening around the world, but what can I do? How can I get involved in participating in community-based conservation? And the second question, take it as you want, it's a huge challenge facing us. We're talking about massive paradigm shift, we're talking about conserving the biosphere, and these sort of complex threats. In that complexity and in those challenges, what gives you hope? So those are my two questions. We've got 5 minutes. Let's have it out. I knew it was a bad idea to ask two questions at once. Okay, I'll start with the first one. What can we do? What can people do at home if they want to get involved? Sarah, what do you say?
I think share the stories. If you find it online, so you can share it to your friends. And I think donate to their cause. And you can actually also email them to do a volunteer online and offline. We got a volunteer for creating our website. So that's like very helpful for us because we don't have any resources. So yeah, reach out to them and ask whether there's some things that they can do about it.
Other tips for how people at home can get involved in promoting this work?
Andrew, my 2 cents worth, I think it's at the moment, the debate is highly intellectual and complex, and, you know, it's easier to save a rhino easy, put $10 in. So I think the awareness of the conservation economy and education around it has to be the first step, and then people must contribute. You know, ultimately, if you're a caring citizen around the world and there's a meaningful community conservation economy project in Africa, Indonesia, wherever it is, then contribute like they normally do to a typical conservation project. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. There's something tangible about, you give me $10, I'll save this number of trees, as opposed to you give me $10 and I'll change a paradigm. It doesn't have the same ring to it, I guess, in our traditional way of thinking. Lisa.
Yeah, I want to take a moment, if I can, and just plug the human rights guide that the Nature Conservancy recently released. I think this is a really great tip for people who are part of organizations working on these challenges. And the human rights guide is designed to make sure that we, organizations are really making sure that they're getting free, prior, and informed consent, making sure that they're really centering Indigenous and local leadership. And I think that if people take this step to kind of follow this human rights guide and make sure that they are, going through this process before implementing a conservation strategy, I think fortress conservation won't happen, land grabbing won't happen. So I'll put that link in the chat for anyone who's interested in checking it out.
Very cool. Okay, so now we're really down to the wire, and I really want to make sure we talk about hope, because I think it's important. Climate despair, the world is burning, wars and political division and whatnot. But we need hope, right? That sort of sustains us moving forward, and not a blind hope, but a realistic one. So what gives you hope regarding conservation economies, community-based conservation? Jesse, why don't you go? Yeah.
Yeah, I think conversations like this are what gives me hope. Bringing awareness and sharing about the flaws and injustices that have been created in the name of conservation and the ways that we can address those challenges and talk about alternatives, I think is a lot of what needs to happen. The more people we can include in this conversation and the more diversity we can include in this conversation, the better. And it's all just part of an important shift that is happening, and the more we talk about it, the more momentum that shift gains.
Perfect. Did anybody else have hope that they want to share? It's like, no.
I think for me, it's just the deep levels connections that we've been being built with the community until the level of like, oh yeah, Sarah, I have a baby. They just explain about their life to you, and at the same time, I can open myself with them. And just, the connection with the community, not necessarily all the complex stuff. That's give me hope and give me happiness.
Cut through the complexity with real connection. I like it.
Hello?
Lisa? Yes, hello.
Okay, I'm thinking about like having a hope. Before pandemic, actually, I didn't have any hope, to tell you the truth. But after the pandemic, beginning of 2020, and 2020 has gone, and 2021 is like still going. How the politicians, how the governments get together, and they started listening to scientists, then I get some hope. But the most important thing is to affect them, how we will convince them, okay, this is not the way, what we are doing, how the economics, how the social structure, like what are we doing to us actually? Like there's a hope, but how we will convince them, like, yeah, I have hope, but not not a big hope. You understand me? Like how we will do this.
Completely. I feel the same way. It's like
we can do this. We know we can manage.
Not overly
this.
Optimistic, right?
Yeah, because of the greed of the people, like politics and the I don't know. Like I hope we will find the solution to convince the politics and governments, all these things going on. Yeah. Yeah, that's
Thank you for sharing that, Hope. I share it with you. I
Okay.
think Lisa was getting ready to say something. I want to make sure you got a chance before we go to breakout groups.
Oh, I was just going to second what Jesse said. I think it's great that, maybe 10 or so years ago, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. And the fact that although there are a lot of challenges, the fact that we're finally, recognizing what those challenges are, I think gives me hope, because only once we recognize them and truly understand what they are, can we really make steps toward identifying, how can we innovate around those challenges and how can we really bring solutions to the table.
Yeah, that's nice. The conversation is changing, and this is one example of that. And that certainly gives me hope. I want to thank our panelists for a wonderful conversation. This has been great. We covered a lot of ground, and I think we laid a wonderful foundation. We're gonna keep this momentum going, and we're gonna enter into small group discussions, exploring how you can take what we've learned now, apply it in your own context, and sort of to continue the movement toward community-based conservation. Before we do this transition to breakouts, I do want to mention a few things. Today's program, it does depend on donations and on viewership. We want these conversations to be shared far and wide. So yeah, if you're interested in donating, my friend Megan here is going to put a link in the chat to our organization, EcoCiv.org. And of course, all of our wonderful panelists are part of organizations that are also worth supporting. So please consider that. A recording of today's dialogue, it will be available on our EcoCiv YouTube channel. Share it far and wide. Get this conversation out there into the general public so it can gain traction and begin to transform the status quo. It is now time for everyone, all of those who have joined us today, to begin to connect, to network, and to share what you've learned and what you're thinking about, right? So we want to brainstorm how you can sort of take actions, take next steps on the knowledge that we've gained and what we've been discussing today. So Megan is going to post a few questions in the chat to get you started. It's not an assignment. You don't have to answer those questions, but you're welcome to. They're really intended to sort of get those brain juices flowing and to help stimulate conversation. We would love it if one of the members of each of your small groups could take notes on your conversation, and then you can email those notes to Megan, and she'll be putting her email in the chat, and that will help us get a sense of sort of where the conversation, what it's prompted you to think about, and maybe guide us in sort of next steps in what we can do, moving our conservation economies work forward. We also have a survey that we'll send your way after the event ends. Please feel free to fill it out. It'd be great. We depend on your feedback. It's important to us. Again, Megan will be putting that link in the chat. So lots of links to look at. Look in your chat if you can. The breakout rooms will be open for the next 30 minutes or so. If your conversation happens to end early, feel free to leave the webinar. There's no need to sort of come back to this main room. You can go route your day or your night, as it were, for some of you. Again, thank you so much for joining. Congratulations to our wonderful panel.
Thank you so much, Andrew, James, Lisa, and Jesse.
Thank you all. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
With that, Megan will do the magic touch and we'll continue the discussion in our breakouts. Thank you.